Where's he gone? Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentle people. Welcome to the Natural Leather Collection. My name's Philip, I'm the curator here, and we're delighted to be hosting the Being Human Festival lectures surrounding the origins and endings of leather here. Once again, we collaborated with the university last year. Just the formalities, if you haven't been to the National Leather Collection before, and you haven't seen it already, do stay around afterwards. We're open for a few hours this afternoon, and we're open Wednesdays and Saturdays on a regular basis. And we'd love to tell you more about our wonderful collections. This festival is actually sponsored by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. And it's a national event, and all around the country for last week and for the rest of this week, there are various events celebrating the humanities in general, and the theme this year is origins and endings. So with that as our challenge, we have devised a series of lectures for the next 3 days, which are exploring some of the origins and endings that are connected with the leather industry. And to kick off our series, I'm delighted to welcome someone who you probably know quite well, most of you. Professor Matthew McCormack from the University of Northampton is going to talk to us about the shoe and leather trade of the 18th and 19th centuries.
That's right, yeah.
And I'll hand over to Matthew. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody, especially if you've not been here before. Today I want to talk about shoes, leather and identity. And I'm going to be talking about Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. So this year the festival's theme is origins and endings. And I think all three of our talks are focusing on origins. So over the next couple of days we're going to have talks about where leather comes from as a material. We're going to think about where leather comes from historically, going all the way back to prehistory. But today, I want to focus on where we come from. Okay? I want to think about what leather, and leather shoes in particular, tell us about identity, about how we see ourselves. I'm going to be focusing on the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain, which in many ways provides the root of our identities today, how we see ourselves as Britons today. When historians talk about identity, they usually try and understand it in terms of three categories: gender, nation and class. And today I want to think about each of these in turn: gender, nation and class. And we'll suggest that leather and shoes are rich with symbolism in all three cases. I think shoes, more than any other garment, says a lot about who we are. Historians, though, don't often consider shoes. Where shoes are considered at all, they're considered by fashion history, which usually thinks about the shoe as a kind of consumer article or perhaps a marker of status, that kind of thing. But recently, I think historians have started to take on board that we need to think about the shoe as a material thing, and to think about it as a worn object, a bodily object. So today, as well as thinking about texts and pictures from the past that think about shoes, I'm also going to be thinking about objects themselves. You can see some on that table over there. I'm going to be doing a bit of wandering around and showing you some actual objects. Because I think if you're going to study shoes, you need to look at the objects themselves, thinking about their shape, their weight, their texture. I think this can give us an insight into what they would have been like to wear, the impact they would have had upon the body. And in this way, I think they can help us understand the significance that shoes had for the people who wore them. So, let's start off by thinking about shoes and gender. What do shoes tell us about men and women? At the beginning of the 18th century, shoes for elite men and elite women were remarkably similar. This is a man's shoe, but it could very easily be a woman's shoe. Both typically had a high heel, although men's tended to have a wider heel of stacked leather and women's would usually have a wooden heel. In this case it's covered, so you can't tell the difference. The vision effect was the same. Both sexes could wear shoes decorated with brightly coloured and patterned fabrics. Neither men nor women from the upper classes were expected to walk any great distance outdoors. They will be conveyed by sedan chair. In fact, we've got a sedan chair over there, which you can have a look at. Or by carriage, or they might ride on horseback, wearing boots that were specifically made for the purpose. So the footwear they tended to wear was not designed to facilitate movement or to protect against the elements. And this similarity between men's and women's shoes in this period kind of fits historians' usual understanding of gender difference in this period. So in the early modern world, there were not thought to be fundamental bodily differences between men and women. Over the course of the 18th century, however, men and women came to be seen as different creatures with distinct anatomies and social roles. And not coincidentally, men's and women's shoes diverged at the same time. I think given the impact that shoes have on the appearance of the body and the capacity of the body to carry out certain tasks, shoes were arguably integral to this process about thinking about men's and women's bodies in different ways. I mean, nowadays, shoes are instantly recognisable as being male or female. But this isn't down to anatomical differences between men and women. Rather, shoes themselves have influenced how we came to think about sexual difference. So, as the century wore on, men's and women's shoes went separate ways. Men's shoes became plainer in style and the heels lowered. By the end of the 18th century, heels carried the taint of the aristocracy and their polite manners, which came under attack for being insincere and even effeminate. Lower shoes did not seek to deceive, and they placed their wearers on a level with one another, so were symbolic of equality in the age of the American and French revolutions. Increasingly, men's shoes were only to be had in black, or occasionally in brown. In general, colour disappears from the man's wardrobe by about the Victorian period. Historians used to regard this as a kind of rejection of bodily display on men's part, but now actually people recognise that blackness could be quite showy and kind of made a statement about men's wealth and their standing. By contrast, over the course of the 18th century and the Enlightenment, women came to be seen as sensual and irrational, and their footwear followed suit. Whereas men's shoes were usually made of leather, women's were typically made from silk or wool. By the end of the 18th century, fashionable British women were wearing delicate fabric pumps tied with ribbons, which wore out so quickly they used to buy several pairs at once, almost like kind of ballet shoes. So whereas men's shoes were practical articles that equipped them for walking and mobility out there in the public world, women's footwear restricted them to the domestic arena and domestic roles. You could even say that leather came to be seen as a masculine material, given its toughness, its dull colours, and its earthy smell. So leather was an area of consumerism that included horse tack, breeches, luggage, riding boots. These are called good, kind of safely masculine products. And as we'll now see, real men wore leather shoes, whereas women, foreigners, and the poor often did not. Right, let's now think about shoes and national identity, how people came to see themselves as Britons. The consumption of foreign goods could be very politicised in the 18th century. So let's consider this poem by the famous poet John Gay, Trivia or the Art of Walking the Streets of London from 1716. This is a satirical poem about walking the streets. And the fact that the narrator is walking is itself rather pointed, since the fashionable elite come in for criticism in the poem for not walking. The fashionable lady whose feet are bound in braided gold travels by coach or sedan chair. Her shoe disdains the street. By contrast, the narrator offers advice to the manly urban walker. then let the prudent walker shoes provide, not of Spanish or Morocco hide. The wooden heel may raise the dance as bound, and with the scallop top his step be crowned. So these are the kind of shoes you should not wear. Gay contrasts these with fine soft leathers from abroad, which were culturally suspicious and not up to the rigours of a London winter. So instead, John Gay recommended firm, well-hammered soles. So the historian Eileen Ribeiro notes that such shoes would have been made from sturdy English cowhide with well-nailed soles. Unlike dancer shoes, these would be wide at the front and fitted at the back, so as to be suitable for walking. The discussion of shoes throughout this poem has a very political focus. So John Gay was critical of the aristocracy and the Hanoverian monarchs. So whereas the Whigs tended to promote polite urban behaviour, John Gay, the Tory, celebrated the sturdy indigenous culture of lower class and middle class people. Gay's focus on footwear in the poem was quite deliberate, since shoes were loaded with national symbolism. This is partly about supporting home manufacturers and things like that on patriotic grounds, but it goes deeper than that, I think. Most shoes were made from cowhide, which was a byproduct of the meat industry. And beef, of course, was associated with Englishness. Beef suggests strength and prosperity. Cartoonists celebrated beef as John Bull, the Englishman's favourite dish, and the envy of the French in particular. So the students will have seen this picture before. This is a very famous painting by William Hogarth, The Gate of Calais, or the Roast Beef of Old England. This is set in France, but the symbol of Englishness is the massive side of beef that the monk is lusting after. If food symbolism could be used to suggest that other nations were poorer and less free than the English, then so could leather and articles manufactured from it. So, just like beef, leather was a product of the English landscape, which provided rich pasture for grazing cows, and also materials such as bark and acorns from the symbolic oak, which were used in the tanning process. So Edmund Burke famously used the image of thousands of great cattle reposed beneath the shadow of the British oak to symbolise the silent majority of the rejected revolution in the 1790s. So leather is of the country in an organic way. If sturdy English footwear connected the wearer to their country, then footwear or styles from abroad represented a kind of form of contamination. Critics of the elite noted that they were corrupted by the experience of the Grand Tour, where they travelled around France and Italy, acquiring foreign clothes and manners. John Gay condemned the fop of nicest tread, who sported his red-heeled shoes on the streets of London. So red heels, talons rouge, originated in the court of Louis XIV, and they were often copied by Francophile and fashionable Englishmen. If you wore red heels, that signified something about you. There's also this famous cartoon here, What is this, my son Tom? And this contrasts the fop on the left, and you can tell which one's the fop, on the left, with his father. His father is a farmer who's come to town and is shocked at his son's fashionable attire. So we can see the fop is wearing kind of slender slippers with fancy buckles, okay? And these contrast with the farmer's top boots, which are bulky and suitable for riding, and fitted with spurs. And you can see two very different sort of models of masculinity, two different ways of thinking about manhood in this print. You can see there different postures. The fox's refined step contrasts with his father's broad gait. And this relates to their choice of footwear, since the fox-heeled slipper would have lent itself to a refined toe-first step, whereas the farmer's riding boots would probably have fostered a broad-legged stride. So there's a poem at the bottom, as you always get with 18th century prints, and it condemns folly and excess, and concludes, "If thus the taste continues here, what will it be another year?" Basically, Britain's going to hell in a handcart. Okay, its manners are becoming corrupted by foreign tastes. As well as providing a means to satirise the foreign tastes of Englishmen themselves, footwear also served to kind of caricature foreigners. So wooden shoes, in particular, came to symbolise poverty, oppression and foreignness. A poem of 1734 condemned the wooden shoe of type exotic, of tyranny and power despotic. And in particular, the wooden shoe was used by the English to caricature the French. This symbolism was widely used in the politics of the 1670s, when Charles II was criticised for allying with the French against the Protestant Dutch. In 1673, a wooden shoe was placed on the Speaker's chair, bearing the arms of Charles on one side and the King of France on the other. As one satirist put it, "When the English prince shall Englishmen despise and think French loyal, Irish wise, then wooden shoes shall be the English wear, and Magna Carta shall no more appear. Then the English shall a greater tyrant know than either Greek or Gallic stories show." So forcing Englishmen to wear wooden shoes meant imposing French-style absolutism on them. And throughout the 18th century, wooden shoes stood for the footwear that was supposedly worn by the French. John Gay noted that in Paris, slavery treads the streets in wooden shoes, in contrast to the kind of the comfortable leather shoes of his English narrator. Leather shoes permit an easy freedom of movement that clogs do not. So footwear can relate to notions of liberty in a kind of a bodily sense. If you wear leather shoes, you can move freely. The availability of such shoes was a direct consequence of the political system. Before the Revolution, the French leather industry was tightly controlled and heavily taxed, so France suffered from an absence of leather, whereas Britain was more successful at meeting demand. During the Revolutionary Wars, in France, leather was required for the military, so clog wearing became even more common, and the sabot became a revolutionary symbol. So I apologise for this horrible, bloodthirsty cartoon, but in the 1790s, British caricaturists depicted bloodthirsty sans-culottes either in wooden shoes or barefoot. Okay, so this is a famous cartoon by James Gilray and Petit Souper à la Parisienne. A family of sans-culottes refreshing after the fatigues of the day. They've been busy out there slaughtering aristocrats, so now they're relaxing with a spot of cannibalism. So it's all fairly unpleasant. You can see their enormous clogs emphasise their kind of skinny frames, and this contrasts with the fine buckled shoe on the shapely leg of the aristocrat who's murdered and lying under the table. So I'll get rid of that. It's most unpleasant. Right, finally, I want to talk about shoes and class. Because in reality, many British people wore wooden shoes as well. And this only serves to demonstrate how ideas about nation were linked to ideas about class in this period. working people in Britain commonly wore clogs, like this one here. Also, there were several pairs of clogs on the table, which I'll talk about in a sec. Clogs were widely worn in Lancashire, in the Mill Districts, where clog fighting or purring was a popular pastime. People would literally kick each other with clogs. That's how they have their fun. Rather than being fully wooden shoes, these commonly had leather uppers on wooden soles. Wooden soles are cheaper than leather, they wear out much less quickly. And thick leather uppers were nailed to the wooden sole so they were sturdy and quick to produce. The disadvantages of wooden soles are their lack of flexibility and their weight. So, come over after the talk and have a look at some of these. These are really, really heavy. You can see that these wooden soles are 3, maybe 4 centimetres thick. They're completely rigid, they're very heavy. The leather is also very coarse, very rigid. These would not be comfortable to wear. Okay? If you wear leather soles, they kind of mould to the shape of the foot. Leather soles are flexible, so when you're moving along, they mould to the shape of the foot, and they're flexible, so they're comfortable for motion. Okay? But wooden soles are unyielding; they don't move. And clogs are also noisy and cumbersome. So you can imagine if you were wearing footwear like that, you would have a rather inelegant walking style. Okay, so if you're wearing those boots, you'd be able to walk very nicely in those. Whereas with these are very, very clumpy, and that would affect your bodily posture and the way that you moved. In terms of the body's appearance, they also exaggerate the size of the foot. And this would have had particular class connotations in the early 19th century when it was fashionable to have the appearance of small feet. People would try and squeeze themselves into shoes that were too small in order to make their feet look small. And usually, if you see a pair of Wellingtons like these, they're very stretched because people have tried to wear a pair that are, if anything, a bit too small for them. Many working people in Britain did wear leather shoes, but these too could be signifiers of class. So, shoes were expensive consumer articles in the Georgian period. Before the introduction of sewing machines and new welting techniques after the 1840s, shoes were very labour intensive and were therefore a significant purchase. So whereas the social elite could afford bespoke footwear that was made to measure, others had to make do with ready-made footwear that was only available in a few sizes. So as the shoe historian Margot de Mello notes, most people in the past wore shoes that did not really fit. And that had implications for how they were able to move. So working people commonly made do with cast-offs or second-hand shoes, and these would have been uncomfortable if they'd moulded to the foot of the previous owner. Surviving examples in museum collections show how shoes were repaired and adapted to eke out as much wear in them as possible. So whereas the elite could afford several pairs of shoes in a range of shapes and colours, working people typically only have 1 or 2 pairs in dull, generic styles. And these tended to gravitate around particular styles, like the blucher boot, a laced ankle boot that shod private soldiers and working men in the 19th century. A lower quality version was the brogan, which often had wooden soles and stiff leather that dug into the skin of the wearer. Cheapest of all was the so-called Negro brogan, which was exported to America to be worn by slaves. Another feature of working men's footwear is hobnails. You can see them on the image there. I took that image from these boots here. These are Stockman's boots from Tasmania, and you can see how many hobnails they have on the sole. Just leave that right there. Hobnails add to the durability of the sole. They last longer, and they also provide grip if you're walking on kind of muddy or uneven ground. but they have the disadvantages of being noisy and unyielding, and they're notorious for causing leaks when the nails come out. Okay? So you almost never see hobnails in elite footwear. It tends to be what you'd have in soldiers' footwear or common people's footwear. The historian Alison Matthew David notes that common soldiers were beasts of burden who had to carry heavy packs, and they were shod with metal much like the horses. In fact, if you look at a pair of boots like these, they have almost like a horseshoe at the back. You know, so working men were shod in much the same way that horses were, and were arguably regarded in much the same way. So, shoes were highly symbolic of social class. Rebecca Earle notes that a deep sartorial gulf separated the rich from the poor by the 19th century. So I'm just going to spend the rest of the talk looking at elite men's footwear and how that changed. So, as we've seen, over the course of the 18th century, the upper class male footwear became plainer and lower heeled. One opportunity for decoration was the buckle, which you can see here. So the shoe's very much part of the kind of elite male ensemble with silk stockings and breeches. Okay. Buckles went out of fashion in the 1790s. They became a symbol of the aristocracy in the age of the French Revolution, along with the kind of stocking and breeches outfit. So Nathaniel Wraxall noted in his diary that in the era of Jacobinism and equality, men's dress was pantaloons, cropped hair and shoestring, as well as the total abolition of buckles and ruffles. So, boots came into vogue in the 1790s, and they remained central to the gentleman's wardrobe for decades to come. This is partly because men started wearing trousers instead of breeches. So boots would typically be worn with trousers, rather than shoes. In 1801, Hampton Weeks wrote from London to his brother in the country to offer him his old silk breeches, since I wear my boots and pantaloons now. It is the wear of all the young men here. So here, have my old unfashionable gear. I'm wearing trousers and boots now. Given the way boots were associated with the military, with horse riding, they were often fashionable in times of war. And I think in the democratic political atmosphere of the 1790s, boots became associated with public life. If you wore boots, that suggested energy, activity, and a statesman-like attention to the international situation. The boot par excellence was the Wellington. And this was developed by the bootmaker George Hobey, following the instructions of the Duke of Wellington, who wanted a simple, smooth boot for wearing on campaign. So as the invention of the Victor of Waterloo and later the Prime Minister, the Wellington boot's patriotic credentials were never in doubt. In common with other fashionable footwear from the early 19th century, the Wellington was cut close and was manufactured from leather that was far more flexible than was traditional for riding boots. So if you look at examples of Wellingtons from museum collections, the leather is very fine, the stitching is very fine, the sole is much thinner and more flexible than you might be used to. There's still a bit of a heel, so you can use them for riding, but they're much lower heeled than boots had been previously. So you could wear this to the ball as well as going riding in it or going on a military campaign. Okay? So, as J. Sparks Hall noted, we go to the ballroom in it, the theatre, the Houses of Parliament, and even royalty itself is approached in boots. And the we that he was referring to were, of course, elite men. And the locations were the centre of the public world, where statesmen were expected to dress and move in a particular way. So the fitted Wellington, like this one, hugged the leg, and it provided a silhouette of the man's body that emphasised the contours of his frame. At a time when men of Wellington's class dominated political life, the Wellington boot underlined their manly qualifications for office. Dandyish but sober, elegant but practical, the Wellington kind of epitomised this balancing act lived by late Georgian gents who were expected to live a refined but moral life. So, in conclusion, I think shoes were loaded with meaning in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Wellington boots, the wooden shoe or the woman's silk pump all marked out their wearer in terms of class, nation and gender. These weren't just symbolic traits, rather I think these qualities are inherent in the objects themselves and the way they were worn and used. So men shod in expensive, supple Wellingtons moved and comported themselves in a very different way to a mill worker in clogs or a woman in ballet shoes. So I think what we wear on our feet can help us to understand the ways in which people lived in the past and also how they saw themselves. Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes for questions, so if anyone's got any burning issues or suggestions. Good. Well, feel free to come and have a chat with me. I'm going to stand over there by the boots if you want to come and have a look with them. I've got one favour to ask you, please. If you could please fill out an evaluation form so that we can give these to our paymasters. They might give us the money again. So there are some on the table, some on the chairs. If you haven't got one, I'll pop round now with some spares, okay? Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.